Oops, I just got the recording notice. Cool. I checked the right box, I hope. Okay. First, my name's Robin Suggs. First of all, I want to warn or just inform y'all that I am not very tech savvy. So, Morgan, I may have to ask you to come back on here to help me out with something, but I think I can muddle through this. Thanks for the information, Morgan, on your program. I wish I had something so eloquently prepared on what I do in my position. But basically, I'm procurement manager for the ASD Appalachian Harvest Herb Hub out in Duffield, Virginia. And what I do is I basically work with producers of forest botanicals and some field grown herbs, help them market their product. We also have a shared use facility out in Duffield where folks can bring their products in to wash and grade and sort and dry and package. And then we ship them for them, get them paid for them, and we take a 10% sales commission for our efforts, which hopefully at least covers some of our costs. It doesn't cover all of it, but we're working on that. What I'm going to talk about today are maybe 10 of the most commonly produced forest botanicals in our region, and just basically a little bit of background about the conditions that they're found in the wild, maybe some really brief overview on each species, on the conditions that you may need if you want to cultivate or manage these on your property, and just touch a little bit about on some of the market demand and uses and that sort of thing. That usually takes, about an hour, give or take 10 minutes, depending on how chatty I am. Okay, so again, the topic of our presentation tonight is commonly produced Appalachian forest botanicals. And you'll see me taking my glasses off and putting them back on as I look across the room and look up close. I'm of the age now where I probably need to get bifocals, but this is probably easier for me so I can keep track of time. And again, my name is Robin Suggs. I'm procurement coordinator with ASD's Agroforestry program. Primarily, most of our activities with Herb Hub take place out in Duffield, Virginia. I gave you a little background on that. It's kind of one of the downfalls of these Zoom presentations is I can't actively engage the audience as I'm talking. So I hope I don't bore y'all as I drone on about these forest botanicals. But if y'all are still alive and awake at the end of the presentation, then we'll get you involved and get some questions asked and that sort of thing. So with the Herb Hub, our vision and Appalachian Sustainable Development larger vision is that of a thriving and sustainable herbal economy in Central Appalachia, where plant conservation is achieved through cultivation. The Appalachian Harvest Herb Hub in Duffield, Virginia is a shared use facility that helps medicinal herb farmers sustainably grow, harvest, process, and sell forest botanicals and field grown herbs to premium markets. And so we're a little bit unique in that we're not a typical buy-sell broker. We actually go to work on behalf of the producers to try to get them the best price we possibly can from our buyers. And since we work on a commission, the more our producers make, the more we make. So we have every vested interest in making sure that our producers get paid top dollar for their crops. Want to make sure people are moving toward getting paid a living wage in this region for agricultural production. It should have been that way all along. But as y'all know, most folks in agriculture have been relegated to the bottom of the economic heap of society in our country and probably most of the West. So we're working to change some of that, at least locally. We also go to work for our buyers, on behalf of our buyers, to try to get them the best quality we possibly can for those higher prices. So we do a lot of training with producers to make sure that they're producing the right species, they're producing things to the spec the buyer wants, proper post-harvest handling is going on, things are cleaned and dried and shipped properly, those sorts of things. So the less headaches that our buyers have, the more they can afford to pay our producers a higher price, and because quality sells, and buyers are looking for good quality products, and the higher the quality, the less headaches they have on their end. So let's jump into the first species that we're going to talk about tonight. First one is black cohosh. And the way I have these slides arranged is first I have a map of the general range of each species, and then I'll have a one thumbnail picture in the second slide for each species. And I'm just going to go and tell you that probably if you're looking to learn plant ID in this presentation, you're going to be disappointed. And I can tell you that probably the worst way to learn plant ID is in a PowerPoint presentation. The best way is through an interactive process in the woods because plants look different at different stages of growth, different times of the year. Sometimes the same species will vary from one part of its range to the next. As you see here, black cohosh ranges from northeastern Canada all the way almost to the Gulf Coast. Now, that being said, it does not occur within, all the portions of this shaded area. And I'll also plug the USDA plants database. That's where this map came from. The USDA plants database is an online database. It has a lot of botanical information, a lot of range information, and a lot of really cool stuff about a lot of the plants we'll talk about and more. So I'd encourage y'all to check the USDA plants database out. I don't work for USDA, but it really is a good database, really is a good website for folks that are sort of plant geeks and into native plants and that sort of thing. But within this range, black cohosh typically occurs in upland areas. And in the southeast, that would basically mean the Appalachians and farther to the west, the Ozark Plateau. On the east, the Cumberland Plateau, which is sort of between the two, the Appalachians, Blue Ridge, Great Smoky Mountains, on up into the Allegheny Mountains of eastern West Virginia, Pennsylvania, the Adirondacks, or probably the Catskills as well in New York. The farther I get away from my home base and my experience, I'll have to fudge a little bit. But typically, it's a plant that grows in upland areas. You would not find it, even though you see states like Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina represented. Black cohosh typically would not be occurring along the immediate Gulf Coast or the immediate Atlantic coast. And the coastal plain is typically, most of these species we'll talk about share very similar ranges. You'll start to notice some overlap, but we're basically talking about plants that are growing in upland soils. Black cohosh occurs in rich mesic hardwood forest, which means they are forests that require an adequate amount of rainfall, but they're well drained. Typically, most of these species in the wild will grow on, again, rich sites. What does that mean? That typically means sites that have deep soils and are high in organic matter. A lot of times in the Appalachians, that means north and east slopes. That's not absolute, but oftentimes it means north and east slopes. And the reason being is that those slopes are a little bit cooler. They get less solar gain during the growing season than the south and west slopes. So all things equal, if you assume that the north and east slopes get the same amount of rain as the other side of the mountains, we don't really have a big rain shadow effect here in the east like you do in the Rockies. But all things equal, the north and east slopes typically they'll produce a lot of vegetation because it's moist. And that vegetation just doesn't decompose as quickly because it's cooler in the north and east slope. So after generations and generations and generations of plant growth and decades and decades of accumulation of organic matter, you start to build up these deeper, richer, darker soils in these north and east slopes. The south and west slopes, typically that organic matter burns up. They're generally hotter. Because of that, they're usually a little drier. The organic matter really doesn't have a chance to accumulate. So a lot of these plants that we'll be talking about tonight are what we call rich cove species. Black cohosh is not always restricted to rich coves, but oftentimes that's where you'll find it. And rich coves are typically those coves or hollows that kind of open to the north and east. So black cohosh is in high demand globally. Especially in the European Union, and typically, and I want to give you a caveat here when I talk about medicinal uses of these plants. I am not an herbalist. I'm not a people doctor. I'm more of a plant doctor. My background is horticulture, so what I'm going to give you are traditional and historic and market-based uses that are current today. Don't take this as that I'm prescribing any kind of use of these plants, but typically black cohosh is used in preparations that are marketed for the treatment of symptoms related to menopause or other I guess, midlife issues with human females. So take that, for what it's worth. And actually, a lot of the plants that we'll talk about are generally regarded as female herbs. Not that they are female flowered, but they are typically used to treat various female complaints. So black cohosh looks a little bit like this. Actually, this plant looks exactly like this, but you won't always find black cohosh looking exactly like this. There are a couple of lookalikes. One is doll's eye or baneberry, which has foliage very similar to this. There are some other. Doll's eye is Actea pachypoda. Black cohosh is Actea racemosa. There's another lookalike, Actea podocarpa, which is Appalachian bugbane. And there's a species of false goat's beard called Astilbe biternata that also looks vaguely like black cohosh, but that really the best way and the easiest way to tell black cohosh is in the summer. This plant will have a tall spire of white flowers that in some cases are head high, shoulder high, head high, sometimes even higher on the rich side. And those are usually present in late June and early July. The Appalachian bugbane also has flower spike, but the plant's typically a little more compact. The flower spike is shorter, and with Appalachian bugbane, it's usually present in September. So in terms of cultivating black cohosh, if you have some on your property or would like to acquire some from an adjoining property, or if you buy some planting stock, it's easily cultivated from divisions. And I usually encourage folks when they go out, if they're managing populations on their property, in the fall, especially after the tops start to die down about this time of year, maybe a little later after a good freeze. I think we're going to get a freeze maybe tomorrow night and the next morning. But you can dig those rhizomes and maybe take 2/3 or half of the rhizome, put in your harvest bag, take the other third or half and divide that up into 3 or 4 pieces, plant them back directly in and around where you dug the original plant. And in 3 to 5 years, you'll have 3 to 4 plants where you dug one. So that's probably the easiest way to propagate in situ on your property. It's very easy. You don't have to go back and make another effort to go back in the woods and plant. You can harvest and plant basically at the same time, maximize your efforts. That's sort of a system I developed back when I was in my owner business in Western North Carolina. I did a lot of management on my own property. So that's sort of the way I did it, and it worked out really well. And it works out well for most of these strongly rhizomatous perennials like black cohosh. Black cohosh prefers dappled shade, but will also grow in full sun in richer, moisture sites, especially if you're in a cooler area like higher altitudes. I know where I'm broadcasting from in Graham County, North Carolina, our altitudes here run from I think around 1,100 feet, the lowest point of the county, to about 5,600 feet, a few miles away in the highest point of the county. So it's very rugged. There's a lot of topography change. And so plants and the way you manage them can vary wildly across a short distance, depending on altitude, exposure, and that sort of thing. But the cooler locations, the moisture locations, and not coincidentally, the higher elevations also typically get more precipitation down here, and the soils are typically richer, especially all things being equal. So you could get by with a little more variety in your planting site if you're in a little cooler situation than if you're in a warmer situation where you have to pay more attention to having really good soil, having a lot of shade, making sure that the that the aspect, the slope is correct and that sort of thing. Again, I mentioned the rhizomes are usually harvested in the fall after the tops die down. This one probably, gosh, I'd hazard to give you a percentage, but certainly most of the demand globally for black cohosh is met by wild harvesting. We do have some programs for wild harvesters in place through ASD. If you're interested, make sure you ask me some questions when I'm done with this presentation. But this is a plant we definitely need to see more forest grown verified production of. So, and it also happens to be probably one of the easier ones to cultivate. So there you have it. The next plant that we have is Goldenseal. A lot of folks have probably heard of Goldenseal before. Again, we see that its range is somewhat similar to black cohosh. There's a little bit of variation because its site requirements do vary from black cohosh a bit. But it basically occurs from Ontario on down to some of the Gulf Coast states, on west to Oklahoma, Kansas, and on up into the Northeast and almost the East Coast. Again, these range maps are a little deceiving. I'll plug the USDA plants database again. You can actually zoom in on these range maps and get like county by county data. And if you were to zoom into North Carolina, I'm going to guess Goldenseal only occurs in a few counties in far western North Carolina. So if that data is available on a county scale basis, then there would only be a few representatives in far western North Carolina where it occurs. And there's a reason for that. Even though black cohosh likes somewhat similar conditions and occurs across a wide swath of probably at least the western 2/3 of North Carolina and Virginia, most of West Virginia, a lot of Tennessee. Goldenseal is much more particular in its requirements. It's going to require, again, generally upland soils. It'll occur, again, in rich mesic and bottomland hardwood forest. And this next item, the fact that it prefers circumneutral soils that are high in organic matter is pretty key here. In other words, it likes soils that are around neutral in pH, a little higher than a lot of the eastern 2/3 of the country typically has, unless you are in places like the Cumberland Plateau, Ohio Valley, Tennessee Valley, where you have limestone and karst substrate, and you'll get a little higher pH. So that's the reason it doesn't occur very much in Western North Carolina. Is most of the state of North Carolina has somewhat acidic soils. Where I live in Graham County, it tends to do fairly well. We've got a different parent material. It's called amphibolite that also breaks down to nearly circumneutral soil. And when I say circumneutral, anywhere around 6.5 would be ideal. Upper 5, maybe 5.8, 6.5. That's generally the range for Goldenseal. That's generally the pH that it prefers. It's a very high demand crop. It is valued primarily for its bitter constituents and its use in antimicrobial preparations. At one time, most of the market was driven by the use of folks that were seeking to mask urinalysis for drug testing. If you're inclined to use Goldenseal for that sort of thing, I will tell you that it is not effective. It does not work. Actually, that use was perpetuated by sort of an urban myth that got started by, I believe it was a detective novel back in the 60s and 70s where someone was poisoned, and in the novel they used Goldenseal to mask the test for the poison, and so some people got the idea that it could be used to mask drug testing. And the reason I bring that up is because the Goldenseal was almost wiped out in the wild because of the demand that wasn't even effective for. So that'll tell you sometimes with a lot of these herbs where the market is shallow and somewhat volatile, that all it takes is a myth or a rumor or a trend or a fad to really affect the demand of some of these. So I don't know if somebody's asked me a question or that's feedback. Anyway, but yeah, so lots of things drive the demand for herbs, but with Goldenseal, most of the research points to its valid uses for its bitter properties and as an antimicrobial in various preparations. Goldenseal has it's a fairly small herb. It sits low to the ground, sort of an apple green umbrella shaped leaf, and it has a very dainty white flower that emerges about the same time the leaves do. Um, the seed pod is, or the berries actually, are a little distinctive with Goldenseal. They look about a little bit like a raspberry. And so the other common name for Goldenseal is ground raspberry. But most people know it as Goldenseal, except in places like West Virginia, some places Southwest Virginia, East Kentucky, maybe Northeast Tennessee, where a lot of folks call it yellow root. And again, I would caution you, that's why folks need to learn the botanical name, in this case, Hydrastis canadensis, because this plant is Hydrastis canadensis, whether we're in Duffield or whether we're in Moscow. Everyone that understands botanical names of plants would recognize that and be able to key that into Goldenseal. So while it's sometimes useful to understand local and regional names, Goldenseal can be a bit confusing because the term yellow root is also used for another more shrubby plant that ranges a little further south, Xanthorrhiza simplissima, which is a plant that grows along creek banks in the southern Appalachians and Piedmont regions of the southeast. I'm not sure where else that yellow root grows, but you want to make sure that whatever you're producing, whenever you're doing your divisions or getting your planting stock, or certainly before you sell any plants, you want to make sure that everything is ID'd properly. I did mention the worst place to learn plant ID was in a PowerPoint presentation. A really good way is to go out on walks with local naturalists, folks that lead nature hikes. And Morgan might be able to help me with the next one at some point, but I know in Western North Carolina, we have some good resources in terms of botanical gardens and arboreta. I'm not sure what's available in Southwest Virginia and Western Virginia and West Virginia, Northeast Tennessee. But UNC Asheville has a really good botanical gardens that does a nice job of showcasing a lot of these native botanical species. But if Morgan will remind me to ask that question in the presentation, that'd be great. I'm not really aware of all the botanical gardens and arboreta in Northeast Tennessee, Western Virginia, and West Virginia, East Kentucky. So any information on that would be great to pass along to folks. But oftentimes your local arboretums are a great place to learn ID of these forest botanicals in their natural setting. And you also get to see what they associate with. This one, again, is easily cultivated from divisions, especially where it's native, requires some shade. A lot of these species that are native to these eastern hardwood forests, they're adapted to some early season sun before the leaf canopy closes in. You get that flood of solar radiation in March and early April when the soil and air warms up enough to commence plant growth with some of these species. But the canopy doesn't close in overhead until maybe like early to mid-May. And so a lot of these species have adapted to really utilize that flood of solar radiation early in the season. If it gets much more than that later in the season, the foliage on this will burn and you'll get some stunting of growth. So it generally does require some shade. And when I say shade, I'm usually talking about 70 to 80% shade. That's not an absolute. That can also be affected by your aspect and elevation and soil moisture and that sort of thing. Those are mitigating factors that sometimes give you a little leeway. Rhizomes are usually harvested in the fall after the tops die down. Much of the demand is currently met through wild harvesting, although there is a fair amount of Goldenseal in cultivation, but most of it is in cultivation in eastern or southeastern Canada right now. The Canadians are a little bit ahead of us in terms of producing a lot of these forest botanicals. So the next one we're going to talk about is American ginseng, which is sort of, I guess, charismatic megaflora. for forest botanicals. Most everyone knows what ginseng is, or at least has heard of ginseng. That's probably the one that gets us asked the most questions. Is probably one in terms of market and use and what determines its value that is in a league of its own. It really, the value of ginseng is determined by factors that I won't go into this evening. We could probably spend a day or two, presenting and talking about American ginseng and what drives the market and how you want to produce it and who you want to sell it to and that sort of thing. But again, if you look at the range map, very similar range to some of the other species we've talked about, basically Northeast Canada, up and down the East Coast of the US, on into the Midwest and upper Midwest, on down almost to the Gulf Coast. But again, with American ginseng, this is only going to occur in the upland areas, the highland areas, the cooler, richer areas of those regions. It again occurs in rich mesic hardwood forest, we've heard that before, but will also occur on drier sites as well. Typically, folks want to look for ginseng on these north and east slopes, these poplar coves. A lot of times, because of that, they get hunted out in those areas. So a lot of times where you'll find it is in unexpected places, like on ridge tops and even some moisture south and west facing sites where folks don't look for it quite so much. Ginseng prefers deep soils that are high in organic matter. It's a high demand crop, and most all of our wild ginseng goes to Asian markets. They enter Asia to the port of Hong Kong. Some goes to Korea and Taiwan, but most wild American ginseng goes to Asian markets and are shipped into the port of Hong Kong, and there are old established families that make up the distribution network within Asia. And I'll just have to tell you that in Asia, there's a lot of mystique around the marketing and distribution of plants. So it's probably a little bit beyond my knowledge, but certainly beyond the amount of time we have tonight to get into that. But it's definitely an interesting plant with an interesting market. Traditionally, our wild ginseng is used in traditional Chinese medicine and as an adaptogen. Looks like this. There are some lookalikes with American ginseng. Some folks think Virginia creeper looks like it. Some folks, I've actually had people mistake young hickory trees and buckeyes for ginseng. And there are a few other species that are commonly mistaken for ginseng, but once you learn it, it's plants you won't forget. It'll have a little white cluster of flowers in the south, usually right after it leaves out. And that will be followed by a berry cluster that usually develops in late July, August, and they're typically turning red by the very end of August, the 1st of September, which is usually about the time ginseng season starts. Ginseng's highly regulated by states, generally the Department of Agriculture, by the way, that sets the harvest season. Again, that's a little different from most herbs we talked about. It can be cultivated or produced as a wild simulated crop. It's primarily propagated by seed, a little different from the ones we talked about before. Root divisions, rhizome divisions don't work with ginseng. I always have somebody that says there's an exception to that, but for all intents and purposes, it is propagated by seed. It again requires some shade. Roots are usually harvested in the fall after the tops die down. Most of the wild demand is currently met through wild harvesting. Cultivated material is mostly produced in the state of Wisconsin and Canada. There's also a limited demand for the leaves. And for those of y'all who I know are interested, American ginseng is also known as Panax quinquefolius. So there you go. If you meet somebody from Hong Kong that's in the ginseng trade and you tell them that you have some Panax quinquefolius, they will know what you're talking about. If they're in computer chips, they probably won't. So there you have it. The next one we're going to talk about is bloodroot. It's a plant y'all may or may not have heard of. Again, you see some similarity in the range of bloodroot. Basically, the eastern half to third of Canada on down to the Midwest Gulf Coast over to the East Coast. And again, upland areas, you're not going to find it along the immediate Gulf Coast or probably With maybe a few exceptions in the Northeast. You're not going to find it along the immediate Atlantic coast. And you're probably not going to find it in the hotter, drier parts of the Midwest, places like Texas. It's going to be growing in more sheltered areas because it, again, like the other ones we've talked about so far, it typically occurs in rich mesic hardwood forest. We've heard that before. Um, if you don't have a rich mesic hardwood forest, you're not completely out of luck. There are some species you can grow, but we're not going to talk much about them tonight. You have to get with me and Morgan on that later. It also prefers deep soils that are high in organic matter. I'd say it's a low to moderate demand crop in herbal markets, and it's used primarily for its antimicrobial and properties and for an interesting use as a weight gain or growth promoter in livestock feed, primarily in the European Union. So that's kind of interesting. Um, it was actually there's a product that was developed from Bloodroot that substitutes the use of antibiotics in animal feed, not so much to treat pathogens, but because of the way that antibiotics are also used to as weight gain promoters in livestock production. So Sanguinaria canadensis is the botanical name for bloodroot. It is grown by divisions of seed. Either one requires some shade. Rhizomes, again, are usually harvested in the late summer after the tops die down early fall. You could harvest, a lot of these plants on in the winter if you can find them. Bloodroot's one that goes down pretty quickly in the late summer, especially if it's a little dry or conversely a little too wet. So sometimes finding it later in the season could be a challenge. So a lot of folks harvest this one in the summer. Most of the demand is currently met through wild harvesting. There's little cultivation at present. It also makes a great ornamental for the woodland garden and the native plant border if you have a shaded situation. It has a really pretty white bloom, big white bloom. They don't last long, but they have a pretty white bloom in the very early spring. It's one of the first what we call spring ephemerals to come out and bloom in the spring. It's definitely one of those that takes advantage of that window between the time the soil and air warms up, say in March, late February, March, on until the time the leaf canopy closes in. Once that upper leaf canopy closes in above it, it generally starts to senesce, or it certainly doesn't grow much more after that. Sometimes it'll hang on, like I say, late summer, early fall, but sometimes it goes down as early as late June, July, and can get pretty hard to find. I'm going to tell you that these that can be a little hard to find once they senesce. If you're trying to find some population in the wild to propagate from, something like this, you may take some survey flags and go out and mark those populations while you can find them, and then come back in the fall when conditions are a little better for transplanting and actually dig them up then. So that's a little trick that will help you in terms of locating planting stock. The next one we'll talk about is Solomon seal. The range again is similar to the previous ones we've talked about. You see it expands a little further to the west than a lot of the species that we've covered so far. It also occurs in rich mesic hardwood forests primarily, prefers deep soils that are high in organic matter. It can also grow in really nice, rich clay loams. I've probably seen some of the best Solomon seal, the biggest Solomon seal I've ever dug or ever grown, that was produced in nice, deep red clay loam. I'm not talking about like red clay bricks, like, on a hard, dry south and west facing slope. But, sometimes you can get some of these mountain areas that have really nice clay loams, and Solomon seal a plant that does really well in those. Also does really well in black, like highly organic soils in a good situation. It's one that is rapidly growing as far as demand goes in herbal markets, and it's typically been used for connective tissue and musculoskeletal issues. That's the word that I usually mess up when I try to say it, musculoskeletal issues. So basically it's like ligaments, tendons, if you've got problems with your joints and things, maybe problems with bursitis and maybe some arthritis and that sort of thing. Solomon seal a lot of times used to treat those issues. Polygonatum biflorum is the Latin name for Solomon seal. It's easily cultivated from seed and by division. Like ginseng, sometimes the seed takes 18 months to germinate. Sometimes it requires double stratification. I'm thinking back to a time that I grew it from seed and it came up the next spring, but everybody tells me now that it takes 18 months. So I'm going to say anywhere from if you plant it like right now when the berries are just now gotten ripe and are falling off, or maybe have just fallen off the plant them now. If they don't come up next spring, they'll come up the following spring. But I do a lot of propagation with this one by division. It's one that actually is pretty easily divided. It prefers some shade, but will tolerate sun on cooler moisture sites. The rhizomes are usually harvested in the spring around flowering time or in the fall right after the tops die down. Some customers want their Goldenseal dug in the spring, some in the fall. And the message there is if you're growing for market, you need to like respect what the market demands. Really before you plant any of these crops, you need to figure out who's going to buy them, who you're going to sell to. Whether it's the herb hub, you need to consult with us first. If you're doing your own marketing, selling to medicine makers and health food stores, tea manufacturers, whatever, you need to make sure that you know what they want, how they want it, and establish a price early on so that you'll know exactly what you're dealing with when you get in production. Most of the demand for Goldenseal is currently met through wild harvesting, and although again it's easily cultivated. And I will also say with this one, while a lot of the plants we've discussed so far, the material is sold in a dried form. Goldenseal is particularly in demand as fresh material. A lot of folks like to use fresh material in tinctures and that sort of thing. So the next species we're going to talk about is not a medicinal, or well, technically not a forest botanical or medicinal. It is a food species. It's used for culinary purposes. It's ramps. And I can tell you with this range map that, you really have to pull up the county distribution information when you go to the USDA plants database. I know like in Western North Carolina and Southwest Virginia, Eastern Kentucky, if they even occur there, Eastern Tennessee, down the southern part of their range, typically you don't find ramps until you get up around 3,000 feet. Now, there are exceptions to that, but typically where I'm from and where I live and where I've done most of my work with ramps, typically you'll find them growing above 3,000 feet. The farther north you go, like up in Michigan, Wisconsin, Illinois, you will find them at lake level, Great Lake level, which is like 650 feet. So the farther north you go, they will move down in elevation in terms of needing, having suitable conditions for their growth. But if you're growing ramps in the south, in the Appalachians, typically to get really good performance, you need to be at a fairly high elevation. And I see Oklahoma on this map, and I don't know where in the world they would grow in Oklahoma, but it's on the map. I'll have to check out the county distribution data, but I bet you that it's probably one county in Oklahoma. It's probably a very unique site. So also don't know, I'm guessing northern Georgia has some decent sized mountains, Alabama not so much, but again, once you go to the south, ramps, you get pretty picky about where they grow. And honestly, in terms of cultivating them, they really don't do that well outside of areas where they would occur naturally. You have a little bit of leeway. You can do some manipulation of the environment, but they occur in rich, moist hardwood forests, typically a little wetter and moister than most of the species we've talked about, honestly. Sometimes they are found on seepage slopes. And again, at higher elevations in more southerly locales, they prefer deep soils that are high in organic matter. And there is a high demand for ramps in culinary markets. They're often sold as a wild edible along with morel mushrooms and fiddlehead ferns, those sort of things. Ramps, also known as Allium trichocum, usually grown from seed, especially where they're native. Ramps are really interesting. They come up really early in the spring, one of the first spring greens to come up. Then they sort of do their thing. They're also a spring ephemeral. They come up and do their thing in that brief window where you get a lot of solar gain, on the forest floor before the canopy closes in. By the time the canopy closes in, those leaves are already going down. Then, oddly enough, it sends up a flower stalk in midsummer, like July, and then you get like that stalk produces seed, these little black pearly seed that are usually ripe in late August or September, where there are no leaves present. So if you didn't know there were ramps there, you probably missed the seed if you're going to do seed collection for planting. Uh, you can do offset divisions from the bulbs, but usually you'll get better results and a lot more plants growing from seed. They require some shade. The leaves and bulbs are typically harvested in the early spring. Much of the demand is currently met through wild harvesting. There is a little bit of ramp cultivation, probably need more, but again, you're a little bit limited by what your available site is in terms of elevation and soil and that sort of thing. So the next species we're going to talk about, wild yam, occurs in mesic hardwood forest throughout much of eastern North America. It prefers soils that are high in organic matter, and it's also high in demand in herbal markets. Another female herb typically used as a phytoestrogen. Plants don't produce hormones per se, but they do produce compounds that have hormone-like effects on the body. So wild yam is typically used in preparations that are desired for estrogen-like effects in typically, females. Or there may be some other applications for wild yam. I don't know. Again, I'm not an herbalist. I'm a plant person, but they have hormone-like effects, and that's why wild yam is primarily what wild yam is primarily marketed for. Wild yam is known as Dioscorea villosa. Also, another wild yam species, Dioscorea quadernata, is commonly pretty common adulterant. There's most herbalists will take either, but that's something that you need to establish with your customer prior to producing, certainly harvesting the plant. Most wild yam on the market is labeled Dioscorea villosa, but I would say a good portion of that that's in most wild yam preparations is probably Dioscorea quadernata. They're not that difficult to tell apart. Dioscorea quadernata has 4 leaflets in a whorl around the main stem, and Dioscorea villosa sometimes has 4 or 5, maybe even more leaves around the stem. But Dioscorea quadernata typically only has 4, hence the name quadernata, quad meaning quad, 4 in Latin. Is typically grown from seed or rhizome divisions. And this one can be grown in the sun or shade. It needs some shade on warmer and drier sites. It's one of those plants that, especially higher altitudes and cooler situations, it can grow on a south or western slope. As long as the soils are good and there's adequate moisture, it actually does quite well, especially a little higher up cooler situations on a west and south facing slope. It can actually take advantage of that solar gain. It's one that you will find also in moist, rich coves, and you'll find it sometimes at ridge tops. Sometimes you won't, oddly enough, sometimes you won't find it much in between, but I would certainly play around with wild yam. It's an easy one to grow. It is a vining plant, so it needs some support. I know when I was growing in the field, I used tomato cage, basically the concrete reinforcing wire tomato cages as a support. It does quite well on those. Rhizomes are typically harvested in the fall after the tops die down, and most of the demand is currently met through wild harvesting. So we're going to shift gears a little bit now. This next species we're talking about is witch hazel. Witch hazel is a large shrub or small tree, depending on the situation. It's typically an understory tree or grows sometimes at the edge of woodlands. You can see that the range is much like a lot of the other forest botanicals we've discussed. Basically, the eastern third of Canada and eastern, maybe a little over third of North America. There's 2 species of witch hazel. Talk about that in a second. But the one that we have in our region is Hamamelis virginiana. There's another species that grows in the Ozarks. We won't. It's a fairly minor species, and it's not really used in trade, although it probably has very similar characteristics to Virginiana. It occurs in rich mesic hardwood forest, usually in moist woods, bluffs, and alluvial areas along creeks and streams and that sort of thing. It prefers deep soils that are high in organic matter, and it is high in demand in herbal and cosmetic markets. Extracts are commonly used topically as an astringent. If you've ever gone into Walgreens or CVS or your local drugstore and look next to the rubbing alcohol and hydrogen peroxide, you probably would see various witch hazel preparations. That's where the active ingredient in those preparations, this plant is where it comes from. Again, the witch hazel of commerce is Hamamelis virginiana. It's a small tree, has leaves a lot, a little bit like a hazelnut, a hazel leaf, hence the name witch hazel. It's not a hazel, but it looks a little bit like a hazel. So we have a witch hazel. I think the witch came from maybe I think there were some mystical attributes attributed to the plant at one time. So witch hazel sort of makes sense. I think it was also used by water witches and dowsers in divining. If you've ever seen like dowsers find water with, I think, peach twigs, witch hazel twigs, and maybe elder twigs, witch hazel was used in divining. So witch and then hazel, that's how it got its name. It can be grown from seed and can be coppiced and also grow as a small tree. Coppice means you're basically cutting down the older stems to the ground. You're harvesting. With this one, you're harvesting the bark and the leaves primarily. So by having a steady production of large, or I'd say moderate diameter stems, a steady production coming on by cutting the older trunks out, it suckers freely. So if you cut the older trunks out, it'll send up suckers, and in a few years you'll have trunks coming up from the bottom. You can harvest those when they get big enough, strip the bark. Prefer some shade that will take some sun on moist sites. And I mentioned the bark being harvested. That's usually done in the spring after the leaves form. And if your customer wants witch hazel leaves, that's generally done in the spring or early summer. In some areas, you'll see there's some problems with parasitic. I knew I was going to mess that word up. Parasitic wasp that lay eggs in the leaves, and so you want to get those leaves fairly early while they look good. Typically, the bark needs to be stripped again in the spring once the tree leaves out, greens up. That's when the bark slips off the trunk easily. If you wait too long, if you wait till late summer, early fall, you really can't get the bark off the wood. It's nearly impossible. It might be possible, but it's not fun. So you need to do your bark stripping in the spring. Most of the demand is currently met through wild harvesting. There's some managed production, mostly in the Northeast United States. There is one witch hazel, well, there's one major witch hazel processor. They're in Connecticut, and that's where most of the domestic production is centered around. There are some woodlot owners there that produce quite a bit of witch hazel products for this distiller up there. So that's sort of the epicenter of witch hazel production. But there are other buyers of witch hazel. There are also lots of value added products that you can make from witch hazel. So you don't have to lock yourself into some large buyer that's several states away from you. But that's where most of the managed production is. It's also a good overstory candidate for multi-story cropping systems. If you do find an area that's suitable for witch hazel, like has good, moist, deep soils, and you want to do some reforesting, witch hazel is a good plant or a good tree to put in there that you might be able to grow some other plants like ginseng and black cohosh and goldenseal under. The witch hazel, of course, providing the shade for those other forest botanicals. So the next tree we're going to talk about gets a little bigger than witch hazel. It's one called slippery elm. That's one that a lot of folks in our region of Central Appalachia know about. It has a range from eastern Canada on down to the middle section of the country, East Coast, Gulf Coast. It has a fairly, its range is pretty widely distributed across that area. I mean, it'll grow in Piedmont soils. It'll grow. It's not restricted to just the Appalachians, the higher altitudes. It grows in a lot of areas. A lot of times in our area, especially in East Tennessee, Southwest Virginia, you'll see it growing up and down the interstates, I-81, probably I-75 up to the Cumberland Plateau. You'll see it growing along the edges of backcountry roads. Unfortunately, a lot of times it just gets mowed down by the state departments of transportation. Maybe a better use would be if some folks use those plants for harvesting for products, but that's another conversation. It occurs, or sometimes it is the mesic hardwood forest that you're in the company of, but it certainly occurs around other trees and species that are growing in association with the mesic hardwood forest, and it grows along sheltered woodland edges as well. Prefers deep soils that are high in organic matter with adequate moisture, and it's one that is in high demand in herbal markets. I know there's a couple of products. One is called Throat Coat. That is a product of traditional medicinals. It's a tea that's used for like throat irritations. Another one is made by Thayer's, and I think it is, you can find it in some health food stores. But there's a little lozenge, and it's also used for its mucilaginous properties to treat coughs and symptoms of colds and sore throats. It's very soothing to the mucous membrane. So that's primarily what it's used for. There's a really tasty one called, I think it's called Two Trees by Thayer's. It is maple sugar and slippery elm bark powdered in a lozenge form. Tastes really good, and it works. Slippery elm is Ulmus rubra. Typically, it is grown from seed. As you can see, has a very elm-looking leaf to it. One way you can tell it from other elms is the leaves feel a little sandpapery when you rub them. So that's probably the easiest way to tell slippery elm from some other elms like cedar elm or American elm. It's primarily grown from seed or root offshoots. It's a medium to large tree. It'll get fairly big in a fairly short amount of time. I've got one out in front of the house here. I planted around maybe around the year 2000, 2002, maybe, probably 2002. You can't reach around it. It's 20 years. It's a pretty good sized tree. And unfortunately, it's one that once it gets some age on it, a lot of times it succumbs to Dutch elm disease. So you want to go ahead and harvest the bark from the tree before that happens. Because once the Dutch elm disease or any vascular disease infects the bark, it renders it worthless. Nobody wants to buy it. It's nasty stuff. So you want to get it before that happens. It prefers sun to part shade. The inner bark is usually harvested in the spring after leaves develop. And I did say inner bark. With this one, it's not like witch hazel. With witch hazel, you just strip the bark off and you dry it or chip it or whatever form the customer wants it in. Slippery elm, you have to strip the bark, the inner bark, and then you have to separate the outer bark from the inner bark. And that's a bit of a process. Little easier with larger trees and thicker bark than is with thinner bark, but regardless, the market does not want slippery elm bark that has more than like 5% outer bark present. Much of the demand is currently met through wild harvesting. There is some planted and certified organic managed production. I'll leave that at that. Dutch elm disease may be a problem. I mentioned that. So the reason I say that, there's a lot of certified organic slippery elm that's gotten into production into the production chain that is, may or may not be certified organic. Maybe I shouldn't go down that road, but anyway, it is certified. Get with me on that later if you want to go down that rabbit hole. The next one we're going to talk about is black cherry. This species occurs primarily in the eastern half to 2/3 North America. I'm not sure what's going on in British Columbia and Washington, whether those are introduced populations or whether it's native there, so I'll leave that one alone. But it definitely occurs throughout much of eastern North America. It occurs on mesic sites. It prefers deep soils. It's in moderate demand in herbal markets, and it's traditionally used as a cough suppressant, and it works. It really does. In fact, if you ever strip the bark and make tea with it, you'll know where that cherry flavored cough medicine, that synthetic cherry flavored cough medicine attempted to get its flavor from. It wasn't from the cherry fruit, it was from the cherry bark. You'll recognize it. And I will have to say that black cherry tea made from real black cherry bark is not nearly as nasty tasting as that nasty tasting cherry flavored cough medicine. So, and this actually probably works better than most cough medicines. Again, I'm not an herbalist, but just based on personal and anecdotal experience, it does work. So, consult your local herbalist before you self-medicate with black cherry bark. Also contains some compounds, prussic acid. I know the wilted leaves and fruits contain some cyanide, so I don't know about the bark. So be careful, consult an herbalist. But I had good experience with my coughs being treated with black cherry bark. The Latin name is Prunus serratina or serratina. Um, it grows moderately fast. It's a large tree. It's also used for its beautiful wood. It also makes good firewood. If you don't have a if you're not able to make furniture with it, and you take one down for the use of the bark, it burns really well as firewood. Prefers full sun. Will take some shade when it's young. Um, Typically, the higher value bark that's stripped from this tree is the young smooth bark, and it's harvested in the spring, like other barks, when it slips from the wood easily. Once the bark gets older and starts to crack, you have to separate the outer bark from the inner bark, much like you would slippery elm. But if you get the young bark, you don't have to do that. So that's a little easier because you don't have to, you can actually skip a step of separating out that outer bark, and it's always a process. Most of the demand is currently met through wild harvesting. It's a good overstory candidate for multi-story cropping systems, which means you can, if you want to like turn the field into a forest, plant your black cherry, come in 10 or 15 years. Yeah, I know that sounds like a while, and it is. But come back in 10 or 15 years and then start to work in your shade loving perennials underneath the canopy of black cherry. It grows pretty fast. So it's doable, especially if you're a young person. If you're an older person like me, you might come up with plan B. But anyway, black cherry is a great plant, great species, and very easy to grow here. So uh, just touching briefly on the Herb Hub and some of the benefits that we have for folks that are interested in growing woodland botanicals is we do sponsor a lot of workshops on propagation, processing, certifications, and more to guide you from seed to sale. So like tonight, we'll do some outreach, some training, that sort of thing. And I'll admit, tonight's slideshow is a whirlwind exposure to 10 of the most commonly produced forest botanicals or non-timber forest product species in the Appalachians. And it's just intended to whet your appetite. Um, but if you do get in production and you're looking for a market, the Herb Hub may be able to help you. We also can sometimes offer limited funding as cost share for planting stock and certifications that offer premium market access. Again, I mentioned that the Herb Hub up in Duffield offers commercial washing, drying, and resizing equipment to reduce costs and increase efficiencies. That's another one I struggle with. And I will say that we've got a brand new hammer mill that we're in the process of setting up. We have a separator that has been ordered for about 3 months now that we're not quite sure when it's going to get developed, but we'll have some real resizing equipment before too much longer. Marketing, we offer aggregation and marketing services to meet volume minimums and connect with premium markets. So in other words, if we have a buyer that needs 100 pounds of something and you're only able to produce 20 pounds of it, we got somebody else that can produce 30 pounds of it and someone else that can produce 50 pounds of it. We can put it together and get together a 100-pound order. At least that's the way it should work, the way we hope it works. Sometimes it's not quite that easy, but we'll work with you if you want to work with us to get your product processed and marketed. And so I will say, I'll plug again the plants database that provides standardized information about vascular plants, mosses, liverworts, hornworts, and lichens of the U.S. and its territories. Those are not my words. Those are words right off the plants database, as you can probably tell. But it's a great resource. Again, especially if you're a plant geek and you want to find out more about ranges and botanical names and taxonomy and that sort of thing. There's also a really good book. And I'm going to tell you, again, tonight was just to whet your appetite. Uh, Learning how to grow these things will be a bit of a process for you, but probably the best place to start is Janine Davis and Scott Person's book, Growing and Marketing Ginseng, Goldenseal, and Other Woodland Medicinals. There's a link to Amazon where you can purchase it, or if you prefer, and maybe we're all better off, if you go to your local bookseller and ask them to order you a copy if they don't have it in stock. But it's really sort of the I guess Bible, in terms of growing and producing, uh, woodland medicinal plants. They really very comprehensive, and honestly, there's not a whole lot of research-based information out there on growing most of these species. A lot of it, I've gained them on practical knowledge, learned from other folks. But there is a lot of information in this book to get you started, and especially to get you thinking about where your thinking needs to go. Maybe may not get all the answers, but it'll certainly help you ask better questions. Okay. So we also have agroforestry resource page on the ASD website. And the link is listed right there. I will tell you another addition that I need to add is the website for the Appalachian Beginning Forest Farmer Coalition. I think it is abffc.org. That's abffc.org. There's a plethora of information on there for beginning forest farmers. Fancy that from the name. And also, I would encourage you to seek out and visit your local arboretums and botanical gardens. A lot of land grant universities, especially some liberal arts schools, have botanical gardens and arboretums attached to the campus. Also, anytime you can attend one of our workshops or one of our partners' workshops, that's all helpful. But any kind of hands-on training that you can get or some in the field experience in terms of your education, that would be very helpful, I think. So I think that's basically, in terms of presentation, all I have for y'all tonight. So I'm going to open it up for questions. And I'm going to see if I can. Yeah, I got out of there. Wonderful. And I'm not sure how this is going to work. Morgan, do you want to moderate some questions, or how do you want to do this thing?
Yeah, I can do that. So, someone did ask, I'm new to herbals. Are there groups geared toward beginners not interested in selling?
Yeah, I would encourage you probably to join one of the herb clubs. I'm not really sure where you live, but I know in North Carolina there's like the North Carolina, what is it called? Gosh, the name escapes me now, but it's more geared toward folks that are hobbyists that want to grow some lavender and make tussy mussies and that sort of thing. And then there's also like a group in Western North Carolina that is tied in with the Mountain Horticultural Crops Research Station down in Mills River, called I think it's like Western North Carolina Herb Club or something. And basically it's like learning about native plants. It's not so much like growing for market. Um, but I'm probably not a great resource person to know all the different organizations in the region. But Morgan, you might be better than I in turn. I'm not a Facebook person, so by choice and by limited ability. But Morgan, you may know of some like Facebook groups. Can you think of any where folks could like join, or their local meetup groups, maybe where folks can go out and meet with folks that maybe have a little more experience that are just sort of on the hobbyist level?
Yeah, I can't think of any in particular, but I just go to Facebook and, search for like foraging in Virginia or, just put in those keywords. And I've found quite a few that, have really, some great information on them.
Cool. That sounds
Um,
great. And it looks like somebody probably put the correct. Yes, thank you. Whoever put the correct ABFFC website, thank you, thank you, thank you. I gave you the wrong website. So I think that was, I'm not sure who that was, but anyway.
You're welcome.
Cool. It is www.appalachianforestfarmers.org. So there you have it. It's in the chat. So I'm sorry, Morgan, I cut you off.
Oh no, you're good. Yeah, I was just gonna go on to another question in the chat. So someone said, Judy said, I'm amazed at how wide a range some of these plants have. How are they able to grow in such different temperatures?
Well, again, it's sort of like ramps, the climate at 3,000 feet in North Carolina is a whole lot more like the climate at sea level in Maine or Massachusetts. So, in some instances, it's a matter of increasing elevation as you move south and decreasing elevation as you move north. But that's a big question. Morgan, your background's horticulture, right?
It is. Yep.
So how would you answer that question?
I would just agree with what you said. It's the elevation changes that would make it possible.
Yeah.
Um,
And
yes.
also I would add that provenance is a big deal. In other words, if you're growing if your situation is located if you're located in Southwest Virginia, you're always better off sourcing your planting material from within like 50 or 100 miles of where you grow or where you are, and from a similar elevation. If you're in the mountains, know that if you go up 1,000 feet, that's like moving 100 miles to the north in terms of climate and conditions. So, you want to get planting stock if you can that originates within 50 to 100 miles of you at a similar elevation. That material is going to be better adapted to your situation than you being in Southwest Virginia and you get planting stock from Wisconsin. And it's like, flowering dogwood and red maple. That flowering dogwood ranges from Maine to Florida. And if you take seed from a plant, collect from seed that's collected from a plant, a flowering dogwood in Maine, and plant it in Florida, it will grow. But it's going to consistently bloom earlier and retain its leaves in the spring and retain its leaves later in the fall. So you're more apt to get frost damage. You're more apt to get winter kill. Genetics play, even though it's the same species, there are different genetics. It's just like with people, people that evolved in different parts of the world have different characteristics, in terms of climate and hardiness and preferences and that sort of thing. So, yeah, the same, with a living thing, it's a moving target. It's not like we're building carburetors here. There's a lot of variability in the natural world. And, I can tell you there's probably be a lot of experimentation involved. And, it's going to boil down to your particular circumstance and which species you're trying to grow. But the closer that you can get to, to the conditions where the plant grows native in, the better off you're going to be. So, if you can find native population in the wild and, if you can mimic those conditions, you're going to be pretty far ahead in the game. I hope that helps.
I did miss a question. Someone asked about black cherries and if they produce cherries always. They said they had a tree that never produced any.
Hmm. Typically they do. Dioecious Morgan is both sexes on the same plant, and monoecious is male and female, correct?
Correct.
Okay. I don't know if black cherry has both sexes on the same plant. They might. It seemed like every black cherry I've ever seen that flowered had fruit. It could be and I'm assuming we're talking about Prunus serotina, which is the native black cherry. Typically, they have fruit, but I'd have to look that up to see if there's like American holly. There are male and female hollies, and if you don't have if you've got a female with no male, there's no pollen source, so there's no fruit. American holly or monoecious. So I don't think that's the case with black cherry. Sometimes, with species like pawpaw, if they don't self pollinate, even though there are, I think with pawpaw, I think they're perfect flower, which means there are male and female flower parts on the same flower. But the flower parts ripen at different times to discourage self pollination. So if you've got other individuals with little different genetics in the mix, usually they will pollinate one another. Um, but without knowing your situation, I don't know the answer to that. Don't know why yours wouldn't have fruit, but those are some things you might want to track down in terms of potential causes. Somebody asked, can the cold herbals be mixed with elderberry? Again, I'm not an herbalist, but um, elderberry, when properly prepared, is pretty safe. I would, I mean, I'd say that's going to be up to you. I would check with your herbalist, and I hope you're not the person who's looking for an herbalist in Sevierville or Gatlinburg, because I wasn't much help there. But there are certain there. I do know that there's a lady, Michelle Bowden, down in the Irwin, Tennessee area, who has an herb business. She's an herbalist acupuncturist, but her business is called, I think, Herbalacha, and she's a very sharp person, and I would not hesitate to ask her advice on uses, and um, probably for a fee she'd be happy to diagnose your ailments and make suggestions. But in terms of just answering casual questions, I'm sure she'd be more than happy to help you. I think she also has an herb school down in the Irwin area. So, but her name is Michelle Bowden, Boudin, and the name of her company, at least used to be Herbalacha, like Appalachia, but with like herb, the word herb spelled out, HERB, Alacha. So maybe someone like that could help you. I found out why two of my blueberry bushes never produced on the other side of the fence. My neighbor had been using. Let's see, my neighbor had been using glyphosate. Close neighbors can cause problems. What they do, that is correct. Yes, they certainly can. Um, are there any thoughts on doing field trips to do harvest or to do hands-on learn? Sorry, I can't read this because my cursor's in the way. To do hands-on learning to identify plants. Um, I don't know, Morgan. What do you think about the grow your own program? Would that be a good outreach activity for y'all down the road to do some like field trips, some like herb walks or something?
I think so, especially once we have our ag campus up. I think that'd be fantastic.
Okay, cool. Let's see. Uh, got a lot of thanks. You're welcome, and thank you all. A lot of questions about getting a reported link.
Yeah. Yeah, I will send the link out through email.
Okay.
Robin, I have a question. So I've heard that people have their ginseng stolen just straight out of their forested area a lot. Is that true? And like, have you had experience with that kind of situation?
Yeah, that's very true. Anytime you're growing something that sells for $1,100 a pound out in the open and people know it, it's like, I guess, covering up your land with big screen televisions and leaving them outside. but but yeah, it's a problem, and what to do about it? That's a long answer. Personally, I've had more problems with voles, the four-legged problems rather than two-legged, but it's certainly a problem. And the problem is that to prosecute someone, you have to catch them in the act or have a photograph or some type of evidence that someone stole your ginseng and who that person is. And otherwise, it's hard to prosecute that sort of theft. Even if they're caught 5 miles down the road and they just left their house, and they've got 5 pounds of ginseng and you're missing ginseng, and they claim that they dug it legally someplace else. You've got to produce some evidence that no, they didn't. They got it in my house. It's your word against theirs. It could be up to a judge or up to a magistrate. But it's tricky. It's a problem.
All right. I think we are good. Thank you so much, Robin. This was awesome. I want to go on a plant ID walk with you sometime.
It was my pleasure. Thank you, Morgan. Thank y'all. Y'all are a great audience. I wish I got to interact with you a little bit more. But anyway, I'm around. If y'all need to get a hold of me, Morgan knows how. So again, appreciate it. And I've enjoyed presenting to y'all tonight.